Okay. Oh, that's nice. Tells me that the recording's in progress. So, hello, good morning. What I'm going to do today pretty quickly is lay out a couple of things. The first is that my intention here is to help you see a dimension in which your leadership is probably missing. And this is not particular to you. This is not like a criticism of your leadership in particular, whoever you happen to be. This is rather we're distinguishing something that's missing from the bulk of the leadership in the world. And when I say a new dimension, the way I want to invite you to consider this is imagine a two-dimensional plane, chess on a two-dimensional board. And so when you look at the two-dimensional board of chess, what there's to do is obvious. I got to move my queen or whatever piece from here to there to nab that king. But if I'm unable to see that there's actually three dimensions to this game of chess that I'm playing, then my moves, when they're restricted to that two-dimensional board, are going to be maybe naive at our most generous and damaging or harmful or just oblivious to the greater game that's going on. And it probably sounds a little bit far-fetched to believe that there could be such a drastic shift in terms of our leadership. But if you listen for a little bit further, I think that you're going to start to see that possibility and see that there's something really available as you start to explore something ontologically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe what ontological leadership means. I will describe what ontology is. I'll give you an example that's very salient that'll help you see what I'm talking about. And then we're going to talk a little bit about why this matters, why this is essential. I'm going to give you a few practices so you can start to put this into your daily life and begin to explore this. And finally, to finish up, I'll talk about what this series will provide you going forward. This is going to be a teaching series as I start to break this down. So ontology as a like scope of study, ontology is a fancy Greek sounding word. And what it really means is the study and the science of being. What makes something what it is? What makes Adam Quiney Adam Quiney? What makes you what you are? What is the essential nature of something? What makes a rock a rock? What is rockiness? That's what we're looking at when we talk about ontology. So what that means is we are studying something below the level of maybe what presents on the surface. Like you could say, well, a rock's gray. Sometimes, but other times not. And so when we were talking ontology, I'm going to give you this example here. We are looking below the level of what's happening on the surface, below the doing per se, below the saying, to how someone is being. So here's an example that you might be able to relate to. Might be salient for you. You might know people like this. Some of you may know people that maybe you can relate to this. They have a list of to-do items and they're frantically working to cross the items on that to-do list off. Get these done, get these handled. And if I do that, then I can have an experience of peace. So they're frantically checking items off the to-do list, try to get everything cleared out because then peace will wait for them. Then I can relax. Then I can feel this way. So on the surface, this makes complete sense. What they're doing is getting the stuff in the way of their peace out of the way. And then they can have this desired state. Ontologically, if we look at what's happening, you have someone who is being frantic, stressed out, harried, etc. That's how they were being. And their hope is that by being that way, eventually they will start to have the experience of being peaceful. And when you look at it at this level, it becomes inherently like kind of crazy. We're like, well, that doesn't make sense. That's not, if I was trying to figure out how to get to a state of peace, being frantic, harried, and stressful probably isn't going to lead me to that. It's probably going to lead me further away. And what happens in life is that we always get better at the game that we are being. The way you are being, you are continually getting better at being that way. And so what you have is someone who's unconscious to all of this, because on the surface it makes sense, unconscious to the fact that they are getting better and better and better at being frantic, harried, and stressful when what they really desire is peace. And what'll happen is they'll spend more and more time in that frantic, harried, stressed out state, and their return on investment, so to speak, their experience of a state of peacefulness will become smaller and smaller and smaller. It becomes almost like a zero-sum game. As this grows, this shrinks. And so you may have experienced this, like early on in your life, perhaps rushing through your to-do list really left you with this amazing, sorry, my mustache is poking my nostril. This amazing experience of peace But as time's gone on, you've noticed that those become further and further apart from each other, more and more fleeting. It's only a matter of time before the next thing pops up, and then you got to get that done faster and faster and faster. It's like the reverse of a hedonic treadmill. It's like a shitonic treadmill. It's shitty. So this is what becomes available when we start to develop the ability to look at and work with things ontologically, as we start to see that a lot of our strategies, whilst they make sense in a two-dimensional plane, when we're only looking at something at the level of like what we're doing or what we're supposed to do or what we say, instead we can start to see, oh my goodness, of course this isn't working. How could this work? It's completely far-fetched that this would work. It just doesn't align. And so that's what ontological in our approach, that's what it provides. So in this series, that's what we're going to start to break down for you, so you can begin to look through this lens. So when we talk about ontological leadership, what that means is leadership as a quality of being rather than a position in a hierarchy, a number of years of experience, or what you did last week, or what you did yesterday, or what you were doing 10 minutes ago before I started to speak to you about your leadership. Ontological leadership means getting clear, distinguishing for ourselves, like what are the qualities of being that a leader brings? What must a leader be able to be in any given moment? And then getting supported to distinguish for ourselves if we're able to be that way, or if there's something in the way of that. This is part of what gets missed in the conversation about leading up. So a lot of people, a lot of leadership conversation I support people with is a complaint about the person above them. And then we hear this phrase like, well, lead up. And what we think that means is like, give the person above me feedback on their leadership, like they give to me, or something along those lines. So our minds immediately go to what there is to do. And instead, what we're really seeking here is that you bring the being of leader in the way you interact with this person. So that might mean things, and I'm just going to make some stuff up here, like developing in yourself the ability to hold people with a great deal of grace and empathy and compassion. Give people the benefit of the doubt. Be able to distinguish for yourself, oh my goodness, I've got a bunch of interpretations separate from the facts. I'm going to set those aside, and I'm just going to engage with the leader at the level of facts and bringing curiosity to what I'm noticing. We could build this list out on and on and on, and we may do so as we go further on in this series. But for now, I just want to use that to help you start to see what it means really to lead up and what it means to be ontological as a leader. Okay. So this dimension that I'm talking about is very, very, it's almost something that people will dismiss out of hand. And the reason for that is because we don't know what we don't know. Until we can see this, we cannot see it. And further, we're even unaware that we can't see it. And so what happens is we conclude before we've gotten any support, before we've gone into this, we conclude before we've gone deep enough to see anything that there's nothing here for us to see. We hear the words, you might even be doing this right now. We hear the words that I'm speaking and we conclude, oh yeah, I know what he's talking about. And then we relate it to something in our life that we already do know. And what that does is it takes something that exists outside of our existing consciousness and it shoves it into what we already know, and thereby ensures that we won't learn anything new because now we're back in the realm of our knowing. So it's very challenging for people to get because it requires some humility. It requires some humility to come to an acceptance of the fact that perhaps there's something deeper available that you do not yet have, that you may not even be aware of. It requires humility of me every time I get exposed to like a new version of this. And so what happens is we can be a little bit defended against even this possibility of discovering an ontological approach to leadership. So we want to have that, we want to be aware of that. And the reason this is so essential in our practice is that being able to see the world ontologically, that's not something that's available to us as a given. Instead, what we can see is what we're conscious of, what it presents on the surface. And this is a little bit like seeing an iceberg in the water and concluding that's all there is to see. I'm looking at it, my eyes are open, there it is. And from that position, trying to move that iceberg, trying to do something with that iceberg. And so we might create these amazing machines that are good at gripping a hold of an iceberg and trying to shove it through the water, but it's mostly going to kind of bob back and forward. And we're going to be confounded in our attempts to transform that iceberg's position. Instead, what we'll get is short-term change. The iceberg bobs a bit, there's movement, but it's not really creating the result that we want. That's what happens when we try to lead without access to this ontological dimension. We see the iceberg, we try to do stuff to it, but it doesn't really make any kind of difference. So that's what we're up against. So as you start to be able to lift this iceberg up out of the water and start to see with your consciousness the entirety of what's happening, both in yourself and with those that you lead, you start to become someone that can actually affect transformational shifts because you are now able to see with altitude. You are now able to see the larger picture. And that gives you access to a potency as a leader that very few people have. And part of the reason, again, is it requires some humility. It requires some letting go of our stories about it, or releasing the idea that I'm a great leader. I already know stuff. Like one of the things that I recognize people that gets in people's way a lot when we're working at this kind of level is they go back to their years of experience as a justification for why continue doing things the way they do them. So you might have someone in this metaphor of the iceberg who's been moving icebergs for like 10 years. And now we're going to start to invite them to consider there might be some part of this iceberg that you haven't even seen that you're unaware of. And they're going to feel defensive because they're attached to those 10 years. Well, look, Adam, I got to tell you, I've been moving icebergs for 10 years and I've never seen something like this. No one's ever had the gall to suggest something like this to me. How dare you? And then what that does is that they then stop listening. They shut down that conversation for themselves, which ensures that they stay right, they stay correct about their premise, their perspective, but it also ensures that that iceberg does not get lifted out of the water so they can see a deeper picture and perhaps learn something new. So as we go forward in this series, this weekly series, and I'll share a little bit more about what you'll learn through this approach, what I'll be teaching you, and how to operationalize it in a moment. But as we go through this series, it can really serve you to practice recognizing that defensiveness and recognizing like the opportunity to bring a bit of humility, a bit of like grace for yourself, and really like receive the defensiveness with a lot of honor. Like, oh, this is actually pretty beautiful. Here's a place where there's an opportunity for me to deepen, to discover something I don't already know. And there's a bit of defensiveness, whatever it happens to be, showing up. This is how great leaders move forward as they start to recognize this stuff. And rather than getting swept away in it, they distinguish it and say, oh, what's happening is I'm being defensive in this moment. I'm going to actively choose to set that aside for the moment, no matter how justified it feels, so I can get with something new. So how this is going to work. I'm going to talk now about how I'll lay this out, how this series will progress. And I also want to distinguish part of what I'm up against, which is LinkedIn. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the ontology of LinkedIn, because I think it'll serve to start to understand and distinguish, oh, there's another place we can start to look ontologically. So going forward, this will be a weekly format. And ultimately, our aim is to help you start to see this dimension of leadership, to deepen your ability to work with people, to see people, and to show up as an ontological leader, meaning a leader by virtue of how you are being, regardless of what you are doing. So that extends beyond the realms of your organization or your peer-to-peer meetings or those that you lead. It extends into the way you show up in your relationship with your partner, the way you show up with regards to your pickleball game, the way you show up with regards to your finances. All of those places are places where we can be leader in how we conduct ourselves, how we show up. We'll begin our next week's show. I'm going to talk about how, like, our journey ontologically from how we began to how we arrived at where we are. And I'm going to help you distinguish for yourself the stuff that you've concluded is just the way you are. You probably can think of in this moment some of the ways that you might have in your head, like an idea like, oh, that's just the way I am. For example, I learned that growing up, there was a way that I connected with people. I like to connect. I like to get to know people. I'm curious about them. Sometimes people can relate to me as a bit intense because I can be a bit intense. It's not just them relating to me that way. I can show up that way because I want to know. And I didn't learn how to calibrate that or anything along those lines. And so what happened as I grew up was I started to have this feeling like, oh, the way I am with people is a bit much. And I learned to turn that down. And as time went on, I got better and better at doing that until eventually I started to become very introverted. And I just concluded, oh, the way I am is I just don't like, parties. I just don't like going out and being in functions with a lot of people. And so I concluded that's just who I was. That's Adam. Adam, the way Adam was born is this way. As we start to uncover this, as we go through this next week, what you're going to start to discover is the things you have concluded are just the way you are not just the way you are. They are the way you've learned to be. They are a learned behavior. And if you can start to see that, there's a lot of possibility that comes on the table. Because if we can start to distinguish for ourselves, oh, this isn't who I am set in stone, this is how I've learned to be, then you have the power to do something different. Then you have access to choice. And then what happens is your range as a leader and a human being broadens, it opens up. And that's where transformation can happen. So that's what we'll be talking about next week, 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on LinkedIn next week. And then we will be building upon this foundation that we grow. So as we go forward, we'll be layering more pieces of this onto the foundation so that you can start to learn a new way to show up as leader, start to learn and see really clearly why, oh, of course, these approaches are failing. It's because there's this whole other dimension that's getting missed, the ontological realm, the ontological dimension's getting missed. So I'm going to talk now about the ontology of LinkedIn and what this series is up against, and then we're going to talk about practices. Practices are what you can take on from here to start to affect this in your life. So I'll speak to that in a moment. Here's what I'm up against in LinkedIn. The ontology of LinkedIn, meaning the way of being that is very present on LinkedIn, is fairly analogous or similar to the way of being in the professional world, which is to say it's heavily performative. Performative, like a performative way of being, is where I am showing up in such a way that I want you to have a particular experience of me. I am, in a subtle way, kind of manipulating the way I show up so that I can manipulate the way you experience me. You know, it's like when you go to your interview, your job interview, you put on a particular face, you act a particular way, and it is not entirely fully expressive of your authenticity. This isn't bad. It's not a criticism. But what we have on LinkedIn is a mirror to that. So on LinkedIn, you have a lot of people posting a lot of stuff, and most of it is performative. Most of it is not at that it's not as authentic as we crave. And authenticity is what is magnetic. Authenticity is what draws people to us, what has people take note. When we're around someone that's being genuinely expressed, we are kind of drawn to that, or we're repulsed by it. It's okay. It tends to polarize us. This is not me saying that LinkedIn should look like people just swearing all the time and talking about their mushroom trips or, whatever that happens to be. Not at all. There's a degree of calibration. But what is missing in LinkedIn is a lot of authenticity. And so the noise of the ordinary in LinkedIn is a lot of posts that are kind of lacking in value because they're so performative. There's no real truth underneath them. And without truth, it's hard for us to get a hold of it. So instead, what we have are people telling stories about a thing they did as a leader where they're not really sharing vulnerably with us in such a way that we can see something for ourselves. They're more sharing like, look how triumphant I was. Or there's a post that's sort of like, here's a picture of me around a famous person, and the conversation we had was really enriching. The end. And so the caveat to that, and the caveat for this series that I just want to distinguish up front for all of us, is that my aim is to actually cut through that noise, to give you something that actually speaks to you in a real way, where I will share vulnerably where I fail at this stuff, where I will speak in such a way that I'm hopeful you can start to get something for yourself, not because I'm trying to give you something, but because I'm willingly sharing my process. And that is one of the ways that as leaders, we can really be potent ontologically. We let go of trying to give someone else something, and instead we just be willing to be transparent in our own journey and to be very vulnerable about sharing that. So that's what we're up against. We're going to do this show anyhow. And I think if you're one of the people watching this, you're really going to gain something from it. That's my commitment here. That is my promise as leader. I declare that by watching this show, you will deepen your leadership and really gain something. So now you can choose to tune back in and see if this guy fails or if this comes through or is this promise going to be realized. But I want to speak to what I'm modeling here, which is as a leader, I am making a declaration. And then my job as a leader is to fulfill on that declaration. And so you have a declaration now on the table that you can rely on me for. That is what I will be bringing. We'll elaborate on this skill, declaring and fulfilling, in future episodes. One other preview before we get to the practices. One other thing I'm going to teach here is the practice of enrolling people. And enrollment is where we support our team members to like get on board with what we are trying to create into the future. This is a very important leadership skill. What tends to happen instead of enrollment is that we have leaders that try to convince people or sell people on something or just bulldoze them. Hey, I'm paying you, do the thing that I want you to do. So we'll be elaborating on that skill so you can learn how to do that as well. Okay. So let's finish up just by distinguishing some practices. Practices are something that you can put into action to begin to start to learn how to work in this dimension. So I've got 3 practices for you, and they're very simple right now. This is not the heavy lifting that most of us high performers are craving. This is small stuff because you can imagine like you're going to a gym. This is an ontological gym that you're going to begin training in. And in an ontological gym, just like a regular gym, you want to begin with small weights. I get it. We see these huge people cut, looking muscular, walking around, and we want to lift the weights they're lifting. But we have to begin with the small weights so that we don't hurt ourselves, we don't blow ourselves out, we don't redline ourselves. So to begin with, the first practice is a noticing practice. Begin by training this simple distinction between what someone is doing and how they are being. So in your day-to-day, just be looking through this lens. This almost sounds so simple it couldn't make a difference, and yet it'll change everything for you if you begin to look this way. Notice what people say versus your experience of who they're being. Here's a very simple, easy example. You go somewhere, you have an interaction with someone, and they snap at you, "Have a nice day." So what they're saying is "have a nice day." Who they are being is "you're a jerk face," or some flavor of that. So just start to be in the practice of distinguishing that. This is a little bit like someone saying, well, how do I start to like notice more red cars in the world, Adam? You begin by trying to notice red cars. You look through the lens of where are the red cars. So that's the first practice, is just begin to work with this distinction, to look and notice and think along these lines. The second thing you can do is just distinguish for yourself who and how you are being moment to moment and who and how other people are being moment to moment. And third, it can be really helpful to create some kind of like reminder, something on the lock screen of your phone, an elastic band around your wrist that you snap, a rock in your pocket that you'll feel when you put your hand there, just to jog you out of the tranquilized obviousness of the world we live. You know, we go about our world and we don't think about any of this. We experience the world on that 2-dimensional plane I mentioned. Whoops, punched my microphone there. That 2-dimensional plane where the iceberg is 90% submerged under the water, and we don't think about it. It doesn't even occur to us as, oh, I only see 10% of that iceberg, because it's just automatic. It's in our unconscious. So your job is to start to jog yourself out of that, to become lucid and start to realize, oh, hold on, I'm trying to look for something. So it can be very powerful just as a starting point to begin to create some kind of reminder for yourself so you can catch that. And if you begin to do that, it'll begin to open the door to allow more of this to start to evolve. So that's everything we got for you this week. I'm gonna try to keep these episodes to about a half hour so that they're kind of succinct and that it's not, 6 hours of your day. We are all very busy. I think you're really going to enjoy this. If you got something, or if you saw something, or if you have any feedback, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Super, super helpful so that we can actually structure this in a way that meets you. Because I'm not really interested in just sharing this for my own benefit. I want to see more people gain access to this dimension of leadership. All right, we'll see you next week. I hope you enjoyed the show today. Bye-bye.